Stories in the USA. It's Stories in the USA. Hey, wow. Taking some risks there, aren't we? Hello, welcome to this edition of Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I am your host, Uncle Scotty. Things are booming here. We have our own mugs. Hydration, so important. Also important, keeping place of where we are in our book. Even if our book doesn't happen to look like a book, you still need to know. If you're interested in that and more, maybe some popcorn, check us out on patreon.com. See how you can join us. Or not. It's up to you. This is different popcorn from yesterday. Still delicious though. I've washed my hands 525,600 times since then. So thank you to our sponsor, Time, for giving us all their extra time when we thought we were out of time. Story time. Without time, it's just... Now, as you can recall, we were reading Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Shaw. And we had learned that this was a school that is 30 stories high, one classroom on each story. We're learning about the 30 students and teachers on the 30th story, the 30th floor of this school. And they have to walk all the way up every day, 30 flights of stairs to get to their school. I used to live in a building in New York where I had to walk up 5 flights of stairs, and I thought that was a big deal. I didn't know anything, apparently. Anyway, let's carry on, shall we? Chapter 3, Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joel to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you are going to have to learn how to count," said Mrs. Jules. "But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. "No, Joe, that is wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you were wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have here, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" Joe asked. 5, said Mrs. Jules. "That's what I said Joe. "Can I go to recess now?" "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules." "No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. "But that's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Mrs. Jules. "Correct," said Mrs. Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "May I have a potato?" asked Joe. "No. Listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. "Now you say it." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. "Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you." Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "There are 10, Mrs. Jules." "No," said Mrs. Jules. "Didn't I count right?" asked Joe. "Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer," said Mrs. Jules. "That doesn't make any sense," said Joe. "When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer. When I count the right, I get the wrong answer." Mrs. Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. How many times did I hit my head against the wall? She asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your wall against the wall. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jules. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jules shook her head no and said, yes, that's right. The bell rang and all the other children came back in from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited and they were laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. Now I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where were you? Asked John. You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What was wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Mrs. Jules was just trying to teach me how to count. Joy laughed. You mean you don't know how to count? Counting is easy, said Mauricia. Now, said Mrs. Jules. What is easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Mauricia. He's stupid. Let's not use that word. Let's don't use that word. I can beat you up, said Joe. Try it, said Mauricia. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Mauricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. I just don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count. Joe asked, if all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jules. Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count. By that time, I may have no hair left on my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Mrs. Jules. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. Now, before we go on, I just want to make mention that even though a lot of us aren't in school right now, this is why it's still important that we keep learning, because we need it. We need to know how to count. If we want to count our hairs on our head, count things out in the street, maybe add some things, multiply some things, learn about the way the world works, be able to read bigger stories. All those things are really important. So shout out to all the parents out there, maybe, and all the teachers, making sure that we can still learn how to do things like count hairs on our heads, even though we're not going to school. Let's have a sip of water, and then maybe we'll read one more chapter. I named this Marcus, if you will. Chapter 4, Sharie. Sharie had long eyelashes. She weighed only 49 pounds. She always wore a big red and blue overcoat with a hood. The overcoat weighed 35 pounds. The red part weighed 15 pounds, the blue part weighed 15 pounds, and the hood weighed 5 pounds. Her eyelashes weighed 1.5 pounds. She sat next to the window in Mrs. Jules' class. She spent a long time just staring out the window. Mrs. Jules didn't mind. Mrs. Jules said that a lot of people learn best when they stare out of a window. Sharie often fell asleep in class. Mrs. Jules didn't mind that either. She said that a lot of people do their best learning when they're asleep. Sharie spent all of her time either looking out the window or sleeping. Mrs. Jules thought she was one of the best students in class. One afternoon it was very hot. All of the windows were open, yet Sharie still wore her red and blue overcoat. The heat made her very tired. Mrs. Jules was teaching arithmetic. Sharie pulled the hood up over her face, buried herself in the coat, and went to sleep. Mrs. Jules, said Kathy, Sharie is asleep. That's good, said Mrs. Jules. She must be learning something. Mrs. Jules continued with the lesson. Sharie began to snore. Miss Jules, Sharie is snoring, said Kathy. Yes, I can hear her, said Mrs. Jules. She must be learning an awful lot today. I wish the rest of you could be like her. Sharie began to toss and turn. She flopped over on top of her desk and then rolled over on top of Kathy's desk. Then she rolled back the other way. Kathy screamed. Sharie rolled out the window. She was still sound asleep. As you know, Mrs. Jewls' class was on the 30th story at the top floor of Wayside School, so Sharie had a long way to go. After she had fallen 10 stories, Sharie woke up. She looked around. She was confused. She wasn't in Mrs. Jewls' class, and she wasn't at home in bed. She couldn't figure out where she was. She yawned. Did you yawn? I yawned. Pulled the hood back over her eyes and went back to sleep. By that time, she had fallen another 10 stories. Wayside School had an exceptionally large playground. Louis, the yard teacher, loves apples, was way over on the other side of it when he happened to see Sharie fall out of the window. He ducked under the volleyball net, hurled past the kickball field, hopped over the hopscotch court, climbed through the monkey bars, sped across the grass, and caught Sharie just before she hit the ground. The people in Mrs. Jewls' class cheered. Yay! Sharie woke up in Louis's arms. Darn it, Louis, she said. What'd you have to go and wake me up for? I'm sorry, Sharie, said Louis. I'm sorry, Sharie repeated. Is that all you can say? I was having a wonderful dream until you woke me up. You're always bothering me, Louis. I can't stand it. She laughed and hugged him around the neck. Louis carried her back up 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jewls' room. That evening when Sharie went to bed, she was unable to fall asleep. She just wasn't tired. And we'll find out what happens to our next student or teacher at Wayside School next time on Storytime with Uncle Scotty. I've been your host for this episode and all the episodes, Uncle Scotty. Don't forget to drink lots of water. Don't forget to wash your hands. Check us out on Patreon. And enjoy popcorn anytime the popcorn is made available to you. It's delicious. Don't eat with your mouth full. I'll see you soon. Bye.